Little more than a month before the eruption of the Spanish Civil War, a riot had broken out in the small town of Tanapandi in the industrialised coal mining region of South Wales as thousands of anti-fascist demonstrators clashed with fascists and police. 37 anti-fascists were summoned to court as a result. 28-year-old Harry Dobson would receive a 6-month prison sentence for his participation. He was an active union member and campaigner for unemployed workers. The question, "How do I get to Spain?" asked by Dobson on his release has since become legendary, as has the sinking of the Ciudad de Barcelona, which Dobson, with a handful of other volunteers from Wales, would be lucky enough to survive. By December 1936, the Communist Internationale had begun funneling volunteers into Spain. One of the first points of call for volunteers from South Wales was in the Welsh capital city, Cardiff, where volunteers would have preliminary interviews regarding eligibility. Following a declaration by the British government in January 1937, recruiting or volunteering for the Spanish Civil War became illegal. The clandestine operation now involved entering a left-wing bookshop in Cardiff, where the shop's manager would secretly supply the train fare for the travel to London. In London, volunteers would undergo further interviews and checks in the headquarters of the Communist Party of Britain. Successful volunteers were given money to purchase weekend tickets to Paris, which did not require a passport, though police and border officials would often prevent volunteers from making the journey. Those who were able to successfully dodge interrogation by the British Special Branch would gather at Victoria train station. From here they would travel on a new international boat train to Paris Gare du Nord. Despite the supposed intention of secrecy, the excitement of the journey would occasionally spill over into revelry, with renditions of the Internationale sung by volunteers as they sailed for Dunkirk. Once in Paris, volunteers had been instructed to go to Place de Combat, a plaza where the French Communist Party headquarters remains to this day. The French Communist Party was the main organisational body moving volunteers into Spain, giving final medical checks before sending volunteers to the French border. From the Gare d'Austerlitz, volunteers would travel south through France by train before preparing to make the crossing over the Pyrenees to finally join the international brigades. The last resting point for volunteers before making the difficult journey over the mountain range was the city of Perpignan, where one Welsh volunteer described as the starting point of his adventure of getting into Spain. Alan Williams arrived at Perpignan train station in January 1937 with a group of several other volunteers of whom Williams was in charge, when they were confronted by French police. The group was dragged in front of a magistrate, but Williams was able to avoid the vagrancy charges given to the other volunteers, as he was in possession of the money given to the group by the Communist Party. After a period in Marseille attempting to reach Spain, Williams conceded defeat and was forced to return to the UK. The experience did not deter Alan Williams, who immediately attempted the journey once more. This time Williams ended up in Bordeaux. The blockade of Spanish ports by nationalist and Italian warships and the eventual fall of the Basque region made the journey over the Bay of Biscay impossible. Instead, Williams once again found himself in Marseille, where he joined hundreds of international volunteers on board the Ciudad de Barcelona. Williams was luckily uninjured when the ship was hit by the torpedo and had jumped overboard as it quickly began to sink. Williams would be in the company of several other Welshmen known to have survived the incident: Harry Dobson, Alwyn Skinner, Emlyn Lloyd and Ron Brown. In his memoir and interview in the Imperial War Museum archives, Alan Williams describes the kindness shown to him and other survivors by the inhabitants of Malgrat de Mar who'd rescued survivors from the water. There was some surprise from survivors to learn that inhabitants of the fishing community were anarchists, as volunteers had been led to understand that the anarchists would likely shoot volunteers affiliated with the communists. From Malgrat de Mar, the volunteers were transported to Barcelona, where they would spend some days in the Karl Marx barracks conducting basic training and being paraded to the public. The next stage of the journey was a slow, 500-kilometre train ride to the International Brigade's headquarters in Albacete. Here, Alan Williams became separated from his compatriots and was thrown into action as the medic with the German Thälmann Battalion of the 11th International Brigade, who had dug in on the Jarama front. On Harry Dobson's arrival to the British battalion base in the small village of Madrigueras, he recounted the story of the sinking of the Ciudad de Barcelona, causing much sadness amongst the British volunteers. Around the time of the group's arrival, the British battalion were being pulled out of the Jarama front, where the battle to defend Madrid from nationalist encirclement had ground to a stalemate following near annihilation of the battalion in the first few days of the Battle of Jarama. The first major action for the Welsh survivors of the Ciudad de Barcelona was in a Republican offensive on the village of Villanueva de la Canada during the Battle of Brunete. After a day of fighting, the British moved into the village at dusk. Villagers began to emerge, and as the battalion was allowing them through, it came under fire from nationalist soldiers using the villagers as human shields. The British were forced to return fire, resulting in heavy civilian casualties, though the village was captured by midnight. Childhood friend of Alan Manai Williams, Billy Davis, whose presence in Spain had influenced Williams's decision to volunteer, was killed during this horrific incident. The next day, the battalion was moved to a nearby valley to attack a hill known as Mosquito Ridge, where it spent the next several days making multiple attempts to take nationalist positions. At Alan Manai Williams's dressing station at the foot of Mosquito Ridge, dozens of wounded men lay in the dry riverbed, desperately calling out to him for water. A volunteer with Williams had noticed water leaking from a nearby pipe. Despite warnings that the location was under fire, the man was killed attempting to retrieve water for the thirsty men. Harry Dobson and Alan Manai Williams were both wounded during the battle, which would eventually end in defeat for the Republic, forcing the entire 15th International Brigade into retreat. In August 1937, the Republican Army launched an attack to take the city of Zaragoza. The British battalion was sent into action in the small town of Belchite, 40 kilometers south of the Republican objective. Descriptions of the battle are of utter destruction, as nationalist-occupied buildings were set on fire during brutal house-to-house fighting. In an account by Alan Manai Williams, a nationalist soldier was brought to him who was so badly burnt that he agreed to be shot to be relieved of his pain. The 15th International Brigade successfully managed to take the town, but by the end of the attack, Belchite was left in complete ruins. The Republic failed to reach Zaragoza by the late summer and early autumn of 1937, with very little to show except death and destruction. On Christmas Eve, the British received news that the Republic had captured the town of Teruel, an achievement that was celebrated as a great victory. The defence of Teruel lasted until mid-February and cost many lives. The international brigades would endure freezing cold, blizzard-like conditions and intense bombardment throughout the battle. After the fall of Teruel, Alwyn Skinner, survivor of the Ciudad de Barcelona, would write his last letter home. Whether he was killed or wounded is unclear, but it is speculated that he may have been the victim of a political killing due to some connection or ideological alignment with the anarchists. The loss of Teruel would mark the beginning of a downward spiral in the course of the war, as the Nationalist Army launched a massive offensive into Catalonia. Following a long series of retreats, the battalion had fallen back west into Aragon to the town of Caliciete in order to support the defence against the onrushing Nationalist Army. Disaster struck early in the morning as the battalion unexpectedly came face to face with a massive Nationalist force, which sent it into chaos, with many killed or captured. Harry Dobson was with the group that strayed into Nationalist lines but managed to evade capture by hiding out in the house of a Republican sympathiser. The group had to fight their way past the Nationalist front line before swimming across the Ebro River to safety. The Republican Army had retreated across the Ebro, where it gradually regained strength until late July when it launched its biggest offensive of the war. Following the first few days of the battle, the British battalion were involved in another doomed attack, this time on the outskirts of the town of Gandesa. One of those killed was Harry Dobson, who was fatally wounded during one of the attacks. Alan Manai Williams witnessed the incident as he stood talking with Dobson, who suddenly dropped to the floor. Williams judged Dobson to be dead by the severity of his wounds, so treated another wounded man instead. Dobson had, in fact, still been alive, but tragically the lack of stretchers meant that he lay dying on the battlefield for hours. Harry Dobson would eventually arrive at a field hospital built into a large cave where he underwent a surgical operation and was given blood transfusions, a new technique for the time. Coincidentally, a British politician who was familiar with Dobson was in the hospital and recognised him from an election in South Wales. She sat next to him and comforted him throughout the night as he quietly died from his wounds. While fighting continued around Gandesa, the battalion suffered through hell on earth during the non-stop bombardments for days on end in savage heat on the rocky summit of Hill 666. Around this period, Ciudad de Barcelona survivor Emlyn Lloyd was badly injured, taking him out of any further fighting. Another South Wales volunteer was killed in one of the bombardments, but with no soil to dig, Alemanni Williams, together with 2 other Welsh volunteers, could only place the man's body in a small crevice and cover it with stones, leaving him there to rest. The mandatory repatriation of all international volunteers was announced suddenly by the Spanish Republic in late September, though the international brigades would participate in one last defence to allow for troops to be brought forward to the front. Tragically, it would be one of the bloodiest actions of the war. The British battalion held their positions for as long as possible, but eventually it was completely overrun, resulting in 200 volunteers killed, wounded, or missing over the battalion's last 3 days of combat. In late October, all international volunteers were transported to Barcelona for a large farewell parade in their honour. The 305 remaining men of the British battalion were given the right of the line in the procession, and Alemanni Williams had the honour of being battalion standard bearer. The parade ended in Plaza de Francesc Macià, where the volunteers were addressed by the President and Prime Minister of Spain before La Pasionaria famously made her farewell speech to the international brigades.